Hello, everyone. My name is Mike Caprera, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's presentation, Adopting Digital Accessibility at Your Organization. With a rapidly changing digital environment, digital accessibility is crucial for creating a truly inclusive world for everyone. For people with disabilities, it means equal access to online education, healthcare, employment, and e-commerce. In the age of social media, it even means equal access to friendship and social growth. Digital accessibility also fosters independence. It empowers users with disabilities to navigate websites, use digital products without assistance, and opens up a world of information and resources that they may not have had access to in the past. I have the pleasure of serving as the Chief Information Officer for the Viscardi Center, and I'm joined today by my esteemed colleague, Will Bubenik, Chief Accessibility Officer, CurbCut OS. We are so pleased that you could join us today to discuss this important topic. I'd like to start by noting that immediately following today's session, you'll be asked to complete a short survey about your experience. The Viscardi Center encourages you to please do so in order to help us continue to provide valuable sessions moving forward. Now, most of you are joining us through the WebEx platform and are hearing the audio by voice over IP through your computers. For the best viewing experience, I encourage you to please download the WebEx application from webex.com. For technical support during the training session, please post your issue within the chat window. For issues loading WebEx or downloading the add-ins, contact WebEx at 1-866-229-3239. Please note that we will be accepting questions from the audience during today's discussion. You can simply submit your questions by typing them into the chat window located at the bottom right of the screen. We are also live captioning this training session, which you can follow along within the captioning window at the bottom right of the screen below the chat window. You must open the window titled Multimedia Viewer to display the captioning. The live captioning link is also available in the chat window located on the right of the screen if you wish to pop it out of the WebEx platform and into a web browser. And lastly, if you want to choose to use the automated captioning, you may do so by clicking on the closed captioning button located on the bottom left of the screen. Now, before we get started, we would like you to answer one question that is being asked to provide a sort of baseline of participants' knowledge and comfort level with our topic today. Please note that your responses are anonymous, and answering the question honestly is essential to helping us understand your needs and our effectiveness. So please take a quick moment to answer it. The question should be appearing on the right-hand side of your screen, and that question is, on a scale of 1 to 5, how would you rate your understanding of digital accessibility services and why it is important? Please use this scale. 1 equals very little understanding, while 5 equals extensive understanding. And then we'll wait a few seconds while WebEx tallies up the results. Okay, it seems that we've got a few 3s and 4s, and hopefully we'll be able to increase that with some 4s and 5s as we are done with our session today. It is now my pleasure to introduce you to today's special guest, Will Bubenik, Chief Accessibility Officer at CurbCut OS. Due to having 3 older siblings with disabilities, Will possesses extensive firsthand knowledge with the understanding that people with disabilities don't have trouble accessing the world. It's the world that has been made inaccessible to them. Will has taken that personal experience and applied it professionally. With a proven expertise and demonstrated success of over 200 engagements across multiple industries ranging from government to e-commerce and entities such as the Special Olympics International, the Philadelphia 76ers, and Level Access, while assisting other startups in the disability space. Will, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mike. I appreciate it. So for those that may need any additional accommodations today on top of what Mike has already shared, I'll be audibly sharing some of the images that are on the slides to provide any relevant context. Many slides today are just text, however. So the agenda that we have today is doing a brief introduction and background around accessibility, talking about developing the accessibility mindset, showing why it's increasingly becoming a key factor in the overall business strategy, ultimately extending to your reach to a new demographic, and why it's imperative to ensuring inclusivity and compliance. Next slide, please, Mike. The images on the slide are a picture of myself, as well as the Curb Cut OS logo, which is a typeface logo in black and orange. The other image on the slide gives a little bit of story behind our brand Curb Cut OS. This alludes to a phenomenon known as the curb cut effect. These are known as sidewalk ramps at intersections, curb cuts, and they are installed in the physical world to make infrastructure more accessible to wheelchair users and blind pedestrians crossing the street. However, the curb cut effect soon became known as a universal benefit to all, such as assisting people in strollers or carts, wheeling luggage, riding bicycles, or running and walking. And in short, when we design for disabilities, we make things better for everybody. So from the personal story that Mike shared a little bit earlier, I started this accessibility consultancy in my journey, known as Nebula Media Group, in 2019. It was aimed to be a full-service end-to-end accessibility consultancy, and then Nebula Media Group became part of Curb Cut OS this year to offer digital accessibility solutions at scale, where I now serve as the Chief Accessibility Officer. We can go to the next slide, please, Mike. Before I dive into everything in this presentation, I just wanted to briefly touch on a problem that I often see with accessibility guides and webinars as a whole. While many people often see the moral, legal, and ethical imperatives for embracing accessibility, many organizations and people still find it difficult to internally justify spending on accessibility initiatives and ultimately establishing urgency. Oftentimes, nobody wants to purposely exclude people. Many times, they just fail to see the connection between accessibility and their immediate goals or commitments or their priorities. But many accessibility webinars are either too prescriptive, too aspirational, too charity-driven, or often biased. This goal of this webinar is to be a little bit different, ultimately to create a framework to help you justify investing in a comprehensive and sustainable accessibility initiative with a lasting impact. We can go to the next slide, please, Mike. With that information in mind, I'll share a brief overview of what digital accessibility is, so we're all on the same page. Accessibility is the inclusive practice of ensuring that everyone has equal access to information, functionality, and experience on digital platforms. And this means that no barriers prevent interaction with or access to digital products by people with any type of disabilities. Next slide, please. Consider that as the ramps and rails of the digital world. Things like websites, mobile apps, social media, videos, podcasts, documents, and more need to be coded and designed properly to ensure equal opportunity and access to all people. Because without digital accessibility, people with disabilities, a large portion of the population, is unable to fully access online content. Next slide, please. Why does this matter? About 25% of the US population live with some form of disability, and 1 billion worldwide. The graphics on the slide show the four main categories of disabilities: visual, auditory, motor, and cognitive. The overall definition of disability includes disabilities which are permanent, temporary, and situational. Many users with disabilities use assistive technologies like a screen reader or navigate the web entirely by using a keyboard and not a mouse. You would think that websites would be inherently designed so that people could access them properly, right? Well, to go to the next slide, please. If you said yes, you would be wrong, because an incredible study done by WebAIM found that 96.3% of website homepages fail basic accessibility testing. We can go to the next slide, please. So with this information in mind, what is it that you truly need in an accessibility offer? Ultimately, there's four key pillars: testing done with real disabled internet users, ongoing reporting to identify those issues, fixes at the source code level to ensure your site is accessible across desktop and mobile devices, and ongoing training to maintain those new levels of compliance. It's one thing to attain accessibility, it's another to maintain and sustain it. Next slide, please. Because for businesses and organizations with an online presence, there is no shortage of legal obligations. I'm mostly speaking on just the United States guidelines, but there are other pieces of legislation worldwide. Look at things like the Americans with Disabilities Act, Section 508 for government websites, and the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Almost all public and consumer-facing businesses in some way, shape, or form have to have an accessible website. The Web Content Accessibility Guidelines were launched in 1999, and the Americans with Disabilities Act has been around since 1990. So a lot of content has been published online around how these designers and developers can apply these guidelines every single day. However, as indicated earlier, because 96.3% of websites fail this threshold, if we can go to the next slide, this has led to an exponential increase in accessibility lawsuits and demand letters in just the past few years, with an overwhelming majority of them settling out of court for sometimes north of $20,000 to $150,000. The chart on the screen demonstrates the upward trends in the number of web accessibility lawsuits in federal court. There were 3,225 lawsuits in federal court in 2022, a 12% increase over 2021. An example I like to share is one of my current clients, a small winery in Pennsylvania, thought that they would be okay with moving on without accessibility, but they ended up being sued for $40,000 and had to come back to us to help ensure their site was accessible to avoid any further legal issues. So these opening slides are ultimately meant to serve as a background to give you an overview and insight into what the accessibility world is. And with this baseline knowledge at hand, I'll dive a little bit more into these main topics, talking about advocacy, equality, and sensitivity, into building out a true accessibility program to adopt at your organization. Let's go to the next slide, please. The overarching theme I want to share here is, will it make the boat go faster? The image on the screen is a screenshot of the cover of the book Personality Isn't Permanent by Benjamin Hardy. One of the main ideas in this book is that in 1998, the Great Britain Olympic men's rowing team asked themselves this question, will it make the boat go faster, as they were training for a gold medal at the Olympic Games, because they realized in order to win a gold medal, they had to go faster. From this realization, they decided to only do things that would help them make the boat go faster. And this applied to every single area of their lives, from the things that they ate to the things that they did, the things that they consumed. It all came from the frame of reference of, will it make the boat go faster? And if it did, they would do it. If not, they wouldn't. So an example would be when presented with eating a Big Mac versus a salad, they would ask themselves, will it make the boat go faster? If the answer was no, they wouldn't do it. And it sounds like a really simple concept, but how often in our own lives do we do something that is completely opposite and detrimental to the goal that we're ultimately seeking? And the point I'm trying to make here is not to make you an Olympic rowing gold medalist, but rather to consider that this is ultimately a mindset shift. You have to embrace what I like to call an accessibility mindset and constantly ask yourself this question. Next slide, please. Will this make our online experience more accessible? That's what the point of this webinar is ultimately, is to help you embrace what I call that accessibility mindset. And to set the record straight, you're not an evil anti-accessibility villain if you don't have an accessible site currently, and this webinar has no intention of making you feel like one. But by breaking down some of these intentions and considerations for embracing accessibility, you can develop this accessibility mindset. And things will start to fall into place because it won't feel like a burden, but an opportunity. And designs and products won't be great despite accessibility, but because of it. You can get accessibility right just by changing the way that you think about it. Because will it make the boat go faster? Will this make our online experience more accessible? And you can develop the accessibility mindset starting with this webinar, and ultimately it won't be too hard. So without further ado, let's get started. Next slide, please. There's 8 key ideas I'm going to share in the next 30 minutes or so to help you develop this accessibility mindset. And for those that stick around, there'll also be a 9th one that I'll share at the end of the presentation. Next slide, please. The first one we're going to be talking about is keeping the user at the center of everything. All too often, accessibility is seen as just another step, an extra step that gets tacked onto the development or post-development processes. This is extra work to take on or another box to check off. Ultimately, organizations that are truly committed to the cause of digital accessibility make it a priority from the very beginning. Great companies keep their customers in mind at all phases. So when you're developing your website, software, and mobile apps with accessibility in mind, don't forget that your users are human beings. It's all too easy to use the output of an automated accessibility scan or a Chrome extension, looking at it from a binary perspective, checking off various elements of an accessibility checklist. But thinking about things like testing from experts and getting input from people with disabilities, thinking about accessibility is not as a checklist. because no matter how many guidelines you fulfilled, your product isn't truly accessible if it falls apart when being used by real human beings. If we go to the next slide. Ultimately, remember, real people use websites, your customers are real people, and design for real people. Next slide, please. The second principle comes from accessibility is not an extra. As mentioned in point 1, digital accessibility is one of these practices that most people would agree is a good idea, like eating on a better diet, going to the gym, any of those New Year's resolutions that you like to set. Yet, just like trying to be healthier, implementing digital accessibility too often fails by the wayside when you're developing or supporting a new website, a mobile app, or a software application. One big reason for this is that many treat accessibility as an extra feature or an add-on, rather than an integral part of the development process and the product itself. With this mindset, when things are moving along smoothly, it's easy to take accessibility along for the ride. But what happens if the timeline gets crunched or the budget takes a hit? Those extras oftentimes compete with the critical, and those critical things take priority with the extras losing. So accessibility needs to be baked in from the very beginning, and it needs to never be removed. And it's a must-have. Ultimately, that's a good thing, not a hurdle. Next slide, please. When accessibility is thought of as an extra feature, that suggests that it's something that can be added or removed. But there isn't an on-off switch that includes or excludes accessibility. It shouldn't be considered as an extra thing. It's part of the thing itself. Think about it from an analogy of baking a blueberry muffin. You wouldn't want to put the blueberries into the muffin after the muffin has already been baked. And if the goal of usability is to design and create effective products, that can't happen without accessibility being integral, because there isn't such thing as a great user experience that quite literally leaves out a quarter of your users. A great user experience above everything else works. And without accessibility as a driver of these concepts, the product simply doesn't work. Nearly everyone knows someone with a disability or may have a disability themselves. So if usability seeks to ensure the greatest experience for the greatest number of people, accessibility is an irreplaceable part of what allows that to happen. And so to really get into it, and let's take the next step in developing that accessibility mindset, let's go to the next slide. Accessibility isn't optional for people who have disabilities that impact how they use the web. Sure, people can ultimately be resourceful and find workarounds, but they shouldn't have to. And those workarounds often don't exist. If for that one page or your campaign or one feature, nobody makes sure that everything can't be done with the mouse, can be done with the keyboard, then it's not accessible, and people ultimately can't use it. There's no option of just trying really hard to get that function to work. Because if that page or campaign or feature doesn't add descriptive and clear text alternatives for an infographic, it's not accessible and people can't use it. There's no amount of people trying to read it with a screen reader that'll make that information available if you don't have that information on the infographic. So the impact then is that people quite literally cannot use it. And if you're tempted to consider accessibility optional, consider that for your users, it is not. Next slide, please. The third principle talking about is that accessible doesn't mean worth using. So when you look at synergies between accessibility, it's closely tied to usability, certainty, and the key distinction of being in the field is that accessibility focuses on usability pertaining to people with disabilities. But when you're thinking about it being accessible, being worth using, can people with disabilities equally perceive and engage with this product? And can they use the product without facing significant barriers? These are just a couple of questions and more of what accessibility is truly all about. By making a product accessible, it doesn't mean it's a good product or that people will want to use it. On one end, if you have overly complex user interfaces or frustrating navigation and information overload, that's just as frustrating for people with disabilities as it is for anybody else. On the opposite side, if you remove all the features and functions because it's the only way that you can ensure it's accessible, is also probably not the right direction, at least not for the long term. So building something that's overly complex, but perhaps technically accessible as well as building something that's boring, but accessible, can both have the same outcome, even though they may be at opposite ends of that complexity spectrum. People ultimately may just not want to use it. So accessible simply does not translate to worth using. So fortunately, many of these same factors that improve usability and SEO ultimately improve accessibility as well. Looking at things like color contrast, having navigation and structure that's logical and intuitive, having content that works well on different devices. These don't just help create accessible experiences, they help create great experiences, period. Next slide, please. Principle number 4 is the more feedback you can acquire from your current and potential audiences, the better. So having strong and valuable feedback for your accessibility initiatives helps you to continue to keep the user at the center throughout the development process and the entire life cycle of your content. Ultimately, sometimes that feedback is going to come in the form of direct complaints or praises. Ultimately, welcome the complaints, because they're going to help you learn exactly where people's experiences are veering from their expectations. You want to seek feedback from these users, because if people care enough to take the time to let you know something is working or not for them, realize that means they probably consider it worth letting you know. So considering how valuable people's time is, and if a product or company is a lost cause, they're less likely to actually share their thoughts. So if your customers are going to help you iron out these issues, don't waste it as a learning opportunity. Feedback and ideas for enhancements are only worth anything if you're receptive to them. Even negative feedback, and sometimes even especially negative feedback, is valuable. You want to incorporate that feedback into any plans for improvement. Feedback isn't the only information your users will give you, though, that spark enhancements. Looking at the metrics, what do they tell you? Are many people trying to act on a certain call to action and then quitting? Or maybe you expected people to contact you by phone, but they're using online chat. Your users are constantly giving you this information that can help you build upon what's working and making those adjustments to what isn't. So at all points, you can consider whether accessibility is helping to drive or limit interactions of these different types of use cases. Many people are quitting on that call to action because it might be hard to fill out the form correctly, or something else that the accessibility department can deep dive into, and accessibility can help you uncover these things. So ultimately, leaving the door open for future enhancements is principle number 4. Next slide, please. Number 5 is accessibility isn't optional for businesses or for legal, because digital accessibility isn't just a smart business practice or just the right thing to do. In many cases, as mentioned earlier, it's a legal requirement. Having these different laws in place in the United States prohibit discrimination on the basis of disability in places of public accommodation. And ultimately, private businesses such as retail stores, hotels, restaurants, and theaters are open to the general public. So when thinking about this, the ADA applies to websites and other digital assets as an extension of a business's physical presence. Compliance isn't a fun topic, but they fit in here because accessibility can't be thought of as that extra. This is similar to how businesses don't fully build something and then begin to question if it's secure or if it's legal. Those questions should be asked at the beginning and throughout this process. There should be no separating the product from the law, and it should be assumed that the appropriate considerations were made at every step of that process. By acknowledging that accessibility isn't optional, you've taken a step towards prioritizing it each and every time, a mile marker on the road to the accessibility mindset. Next slide, please. Stop me if you've heard these familiar sounds. Accessibility is too hard to figure out. Accessibility only benefits a small percentage of the population. Accessibility is too expensive. We just need a quick checklist. This is disrupting our design and business processes. And we need to make sure that complying with these standards doesn't ruin our experience for our target audience. We just want to check off the box and move on. What if we don't follow accessibility on our site? Or what if this one page or feature, we just let accessibility slide? We have a timeline and stakeholders to satisfy. Where does accessibility fit into that? So if these sentiments reflect your own or what you've heard from your organization, ultimately that's what this webinar is for. This impact can be measured in different statistics, like the 25% of US adults that have a disability, or it can be measured in the lost opportunity or revenue, like the billions that companies are losing by not creating accessible experiences. Next slide, please. Ultimately, we hear this time and time again, looking at the ROI for accessibility, because for those that need a business argument for accessibility, that's what these next 2 slides are for. Is there a measurable return on investment? There is. And ultimately, it can be calculated in simple terms by the total amount of increased revenue attributable to those accessibility efforts, and then you divide it by the total cost of your accessibility solutions. That's what this equation on the slide shows. Net profit attributed to accessibility divided by the total investment or your spend on accessibility. The important thing, though, is that despite evidence of positive effects on revenue generating ideas, ultimately some may still only view accessibility as a development or a compliance cost. However, that doesn't change the fact that it is a legal requirement. So the ROI for accessibility truly hinges on the approach behind the initiative. Minimum action is mandatory, but to see on a return, it must be done well. It's something that we like to say here at CurbCut OS is that compliance creates opportunity. So by exploring ways to capitalize on accessibility investments, instead of seeking to minimize them, you're able to embrace that accessibility mindset, not just as a compliance box, but a true opportunity where you get a return on your investment. Next slide, please. And here's just some arguments that you can share for the business case for digital accessibility. One being improving your usability, because accessibility enhances functionality, layout, flow, style, and design. That improves the experience for everyone. You can increase your customer engagement, because when someone can effectively engage with your content, they're going to spend more time on your site and likely to return. There's a statistic that brands that offer a superior customer experience bring in 5.7 times more revenue than competitors who lag behind. Accessibility is just like that. Limiting the legal risk. Digital accessibility is mandatory, so if you fail to comply with these different jurisdictional requirements, you can have demand letters, lawsuits, and penalties that come from it. The potential cost just to fight a lawsuit could be around $25,000. By taking a proactive approach to accessibility, you're protecting your plans to keep it on time and on budget, because settlements are disruptive, expensive, and ultimately they're avoidable by embracing accessibility from the start. Number 4 is supporting the aging population, because the population of people that are 80 years or over is going to triple to 426 million people by 2050. And without digital accessibility, many will be unable to access this essential information, products, or services. Delivering inclusive experiences is number 5. By creating content that meets these standards, it doesn't make you just compliant, it creates that opportunity. Because people with disabilities have around $6 trillion in global spending power worldwide. Number 6 is improving your SEO. A handful of WCAG success criteria align with SEO best practices, and ultimately this helps your website rank higher in Google. Accessible sites are able to index to Google. You do have a blind customer. Its name is Google. And if you don't have a site that is properly indexable by embracing accessibility best practices, you'll suffer in the search results. Number 7 is lower operating costs and tax incentives, because technology updates and redesigns that include accessibility ultimately reduce costs for ongoing maintenance and service. And also, if you're a business in the United States that meets certain criteria, you're also eligible to receive 50% of your accessibility investments back in tax credits year over year. Number 8 is your brand reputation, because accessibility oftentimes is put into a box of corporate social responsibility or community relations. Oftentimes, the problems reflect poorly on brands. 69% of disabled customers with accessibility needs will click away from a website that they find difficult to use. Over 75% of those customers will spend their money not necessarily on the website that offers the cheapest products, but where the fewest barriers are placed in their way. So most businesses will be unaware that they're losing their income on this, because 90% of customers that have difficulty using a site will not contact them. On the flip side, promoting this true, equitable, inclusive experience is central to these brand principles. You're showcasing yourself by delivering a great user experience that differentiates itself. It builds positive brand association and ultimately positions your organization as a leader. There's no negative implications by showcasing yourself as an inclusive brand. Number 9 is the network effect. When blind consumers hear about an accessible site, they'll pass it on to another, and someone else will pass it on to another. Sites that don't engineer the right experience lose these opportunities and are unaware of the impact, not just on their users with disabilities, but their families, friends, and communities. Don't underestimate the network effect. So given the scope of operations of most major organizations today, there's potential for damages if accessibility is not addressed the right way. And if you wait to doing these things, they'll be unaware of the positive ripple effects, as well as the barriers that they're going to be encountering until they're faced with a demand letter or a lawsuit. We can go to the next slide, please. 1 second. So the infographic that's on this slide is the cost of accessibility bugs. This demonstrates what's called a shift left approach, where accessibility testing is ultimately performed earlier on in the design and development stages, rather than waiting until the end of the development cycle or after the product's been released. This demonstrates that the longer it takes to discover an accessibility bug, the more it's going to cost your organization to fix it. It's like the age-old expression, an ounce of prevention is better than a pound of cure. Next slide, please. Number 6, understanding goals and challenges. So from all of these things of the accessibility mindset, let's look at how we practically implement this into our workflows and processes. So not everyone has to be a technical expert and understand every single in and out of the standards like the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. There's 78 criteria to understand. But to really succeed at delivering digital accessibility and to develop this accessibility mindset, you have to understand where these efforts your organization is going and trying to achieve and what can stand in the way. What are your ultimate goals and what are the challenges? Because when a product or service is accessible, people with different types of disabilities are able to use it independently. It's really a simple concept when you incorporate accessibility, but things can get more complicated when accessibility isn't met because it presents more substantial barriers. So for example, if you have a website that's largely video-based content, that could make it harder for those to use alternatives to understand the audio like closed captions. Said in another way, we go to the next slide, please. Accessibility is quite literally the difference between inclusion and exclusion. When something isn't accessible, there are people, many people, that just can't use it. Accessibility doesn't necessarily mean special treatment. It just consists of solutions that break down barriers, usually unnecessary barriers, that stand in the way of achieving the same thing, equal and independent use of digital content. By taking a step back and asking where accessibility is going to take you on this journey and how it's trying to take you there, it can be enough to start uncovering and eradicating those types of obstacles, whether or not you're a developer or technically minded. Next slide, please. One common objection to digital accessibility, although it's misguided, is that it benefits too few people to be worth it. Not only is that not the case, but digital accessibility benefits all of your users, because most businesses serve many more customers with disabilities than they actually realize. But even if you did know that not many of your customers have disabilities or use assistive technologies, there's a high chance that you're asking yourself the wrong question. You might be asking, why do we need to do all of this to accommodate so few people? But what are we missing? What are we doing wrong that prevents us from reaching so many users with disabilities? Just by flipping the narrative, accessibility becomes more of an opportunity than a liability. Next slide, please. Some real life examples to also think about. Have you ever been watching a video on your phone, maybe on the train or at the office with the sound off? Likely. Most videos on Facebook are watched without sound. But if the video had accurate captions, you were probably fine. But if not, you probably just clicked away or swiped away onto the next video. Captions are a really easy example to paint this picture of accessibility because they're critical for those that are deaf or hard of hearing, but they ultimately benefit everybody. There's more to that same video you were just watching. Did that video have fast moving or flashing content that made you dizzy? Or was it a nuisance, or did it trigger a migraine? Or do you have a photosensitivity disorder and it might have triggered a seizure? That flashing content could have gone from annoying to dangerous. And following accessibility best practices would have avoided that entirely. What about if you've been in an area with a slow internet connection and you wanted to visit a website and it just wasn't loading, and it was taking forever for images to load, but you needed to know that those images were showing. If those images had text alternatives, you probably got the information that you needed. But if not, you probably didn't, and you left that site without second thought. So these are just a couple of examples that represent a few of countless opportunities where accessibility makes things better for everybody. So as you develop this accessibility mindset, these scenarios will become increasingly apparent and difficult to ignore. Next slide, please. So a key part to developing this mindset is committing to experiences that are accessible by default. The website should be accessible in its natural state, and this shouldn't have to be done proactively. The site visitor shouldn't have to go to an accessible version of something because then it isn't accessible by default. An analogy I like to give is imagine you're getting into your car. You have your preset features of the AC, the steering wheel, the radio. Those are your preset features. But then imagine every time you got into your car, those features were reset. That's oftentimes the experience that someone that's using assistive technologies encounters when they visit a site where there's a separate quote unquote accessible experience. Nothing will ever be totally accessible to everybody all the time. So while part of this includes not forcing people to ask for accommodations, ultimately it just acknowledges that people will at some point have requests for help. So it's reasonable to do so just by showcasing that you are able to commit to those accommodations. And if you can't, what can you do to help them get that information or to complete their particular task? The last thing you want, and I tell this all the time to my clients, is that you say that you're committed to accessibility, someone makes a request for an accommodation, and they're met with a blank stare. Next slide, please. Those were the 8 ones. So you've made it through the 8 ideas of the accessibility mindset. Ultimately, when we're looking at now the short-term and long-term approaches, just note that this reality is the first attempt of doing this is going to be awful. You're going to run into people that are going to make your life harder. You're going to learn that accessibility isn't an add-on, and you can't just stop at good practices. Ultimately, everything needs to be great to provide this equal opportunity and experience. So how do you know when your accessibility efforts are over and you can give yourself a pat on the back? Well, never. The need for digital accessibility never ends. It's a journey, not a destination. Accessibility isn't that one-time fix, nor is it not a yes or no question. Nothing can be 100% accessible for every single user on planet Earth. And if somebody is claiming that to you, they're lying to you. Because something can be accessible to one person one day and not accessible to that same person the next. Because things change, things break, things evolve, and those can be part of a well-functioning accessibility operation. Ultimately, we're trying to accomplish what is called reasonable accessibility and reasonable adjustment. Accessibility may happen gradually, but a big part of developing that mindset is keeping the big picture in mind. If your site hasn't been tested by an expert, let's start there. Let's look at alternative text. Let's look at color contrast. Just don't fail to do anything because you can't do everything at once. Small and steady wins the race. Next slide, please. So let's look at some of the different approaches that you can take. There's a short-term approach where right now you can focus on fixing what you can, because a website that's 50% accessible is better than a website that isn't accessible at all. So with the short-term approach, you can follow 3 basic steps. Find these issues, prioritize these issues, and fix these issues. Next slide, please. When you're looking at finding the issues, you can look at what issues are currently affecting your website so you have an idea of where these problems are. You can use free automated testing tools such as Wave and AxeCore, AxeDev tools, and you can use manual assessments using assistive technologies like JAWS, NVDA, and VoiceOver. VoiceOver and NVDA are free screen readers. And if you need help with that manual testing portion, you can seek out a freelancer or an agency that's certified, such as the Trusted Tester Certification or the IAAP, International Association of Accessibility Professionals. And you can also look for those that have a lived experience. Your end users are those with disabilities, ultimately engaging with them throughout the process to find these issues. Next slide, please. From there, once those issues are identified, you want to prioritize those issues into your reporting. If you can't fix all of them right now, you can focus on the high priority ones. Ultimately, these issues can then be prioritized, and look at the ones that identify the key processes on your website, such as checkout or registration. Another option is to focus on important pages like your homepage or your most accessed content. Look at your Google Analytics. Where are most of your users coming from, and how can you ensure that you're fixing issues that go to those key pages? Another option is to see what issues can be most easily fixed and return the greatest benefits. For example, you may decide to add transcripts to all of your audio content. It not only improves accessibility, but it also improves your SEO. Next slide, please. Once all of these issues have been found and prioritized, ultimately then it goes into fixing it. Once there's a plan in place to identify and prioritizing these, it goes into that fixing or remediation phase. Remediation methods can include a variety of different fixes, but be wary of quick fix solutions such as accessibility overlays, because true accessibility is done at the source code level. You want to make sure that the staff members in charge of fixing these issues have the right training and resources to do the job. Ultimately, this is a collaboration. If you remember the cost of accessibility bugs infographic earlier, you want to include people in the design and development phase, looking at content creators, and of course, those end users with disabilities. Next slide, please. So now when we're looking at the long-term approach. With this approach, you want to make sure that it's not just attaining accessibility, but maintaining and sustaining it for the long term. This is through that shift left approach. Ultimately, we're breaking this down into 3 parts. The first one is congratulating yourself, because by being here today, you've already started this accessibility journey and making this a part of your strategy. Build on this momentum. Start by learning the basics of accessibility, making a case about how this will benefit the company, because you want all of your major stakeholders on board, using the tools to scan your website like I shared in the short-term approach, and ultimately furthering your knowledge, because once you know where those issues are, you can seek out training and other forms of knowledge to those specific issues. Next slide, please. From there, you plan. There's different steps that you can go from here, including determining your resources, setting goals and milestones, setting policies, gathering resources against them, and then ultimately assigning those roles and responsibilities, because there may be different team members that are affected by this. How do you define those roles into your organization, and how do you assign those responsibilities? From there, you prioritize those issues, and then you're able to set up a monitoring system. You can then determine and set tangible key performance indicators, KPIs, against these things. A clear example of a goal or a milestone could be a site-wide goal. Have your website be level A accessible within 1 year and double A accessible within 18 months. There you now have tangible metrics that you can track against. Next slide, please. From there, you go into implementing it. Accessibility isn't something that you just do once. After you implement this plan, you have to do it regularly to review it for success. Some steps that you can do is putting new policies into practice, evaluating these progresses and analyzing the results. Ultimately, accessibility evaluations should be done as the times of other evaluations like your QA processes. Reprioritizing these things after you've evaluated them. Everything is bound to change. Making sure that these priorities are reflected with those milestones. Ultimately, you can come across those unforeseen issues, but ultimately make sure that you're communicating successes. Having those achievements is ultimately vital to getting the support of your resources to sustain this progress. Ultimately, as mentioned, it's a journey and not a destination. You need to continuously monitor these things. Legislation can change, and making sure what standards apply to your website for the long term. Next slide, please. And congratulations, you've made it to the end of my presentation. And I'm going to leave it to you for these parting thoughts. Ultimately, accessibility, like everything else, evolves. There's going to be new accessibility best practices and standards emerging over time, and this is a good thing. But it doesn't mean that the ground is constantly shifting under our feet, and that it isn't worth creating something that's accessible today because it'll be outdated tomorrow. In fact, it's really just about these core facets of accessibility. People will always need content available in a way that they can perceive, use, and contribute to. Because 20 years ago, there was no such thing as a smartphone, and now there's mobile accessibility standards. So ultimately, imagining if nobody contributed to these new best practices for video games or virtual reality. The fact that accessibility is continuously evolving helps us innovate to continue to push the envelope. Next slide, please. And this is the final idea that I wanted to share with you here. To embrace that accessibility mindset, embrace change. I hope that this information presented helps you to take accessibility and start looking at taking this digital presence to the next level. Because developing the accessibility mindset is much more than just learning how to meet these minimum accessibility compliance requirements. Accessibility can propel businesses forward, and it's up to you to harness that power. Thank you for your time, and I think we're going to go to the Q&A portion.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Will. That was some fantastic information that you were able to share with us. Now, let's take some participant questions. Please keep in mind that we will try and answer as many questions as we can. However, due to the number of participants and the limited time, we may not have the capacity to answer all of them on this webinar. So please start entering your questions in the chat window below. Okay, and there does seem like a few have come in, Will. The first one is there any other ways of government enforcement with regards to website accessibility, or is it just based on lawsuits?
Mostly right now, you're starting to see it enforced through the legal system. We are starting to see, though, that bills that are being introduced at the federal level, as well as at the state level. For example, there's a bill that's being introduced in the state of California right now that's going to further mandate its accessibility requirements under the Unroe Act. The state of Colorado is mandating that all of their public entities are accessible. So we're starting to see a lot of those standards be adopted through the legal system. That's ultimately the starting point where we're starting to see accessibility compliance start shifting.
Another one here is, does digital accessibility require C-suite or executive level buy-in in order to make effective change?
Ultimately, I would like to say yes, because you need that top-down buy-in. If somebody doesn't understand what it is that they're investing in, C-suite buy-in is a really big part of ensuring that accessibility is implemented throughout the entire organization. Because how often have you presented a brand new idea to senior leadership or management and the idea has been shot down? By having this be bought in by C-suite and leadership executives throughout the company, you can ensure that you're going to have the right stakeholders embracing accessibility rather than an uphill battle.
Okay. Another one here is, can digital accessibility be subjective, or does it have to follow the WCAG guidelines exactly?
From a technical perspective, you want to ensure that everything is meeting the WCAG standards, but ultimately there is some subjectivity within the WCAG standards itself. That's where you want to try and seek as much user feedback as possible, because something that might be stated in the WCAG standards might be a little bit different than the actual user experience that you're encountering. There's multiple ways to skin a cat. There's multiple ways to check off that quote unquote compliance box. So there's not a one size fits all solution for every single type of accessibility issue. Ultimately, it's finding the solution that'll best fit what your specific needs are.
Okay. Another one here. Does digital accessibility apply to just websites, or are there any other components that must be included?
Yes, like I shared earlier, not just your website. You may have videos, you may have social media posts, you might have podcast episodes, you might have mobile applications. Pretty much anything that is being shared in an online format has to be accessible in some way, shape, or form. So for social media, there's different types of setups that you'll need to consider. For video accessibility, for document accessibility, are you publicly sharing PDF or Word documents? All different types of digital assets have digital accessibility baked into them as well.
Okay, and I guess a great segue to the next question. Do you have any recommendations on how to make social media content more accessible?
Absolutely. Each social media platform has their features and their limitations on what you can consider for accessibility. There is a website, I believe it's literally called Accessible Social, that gives a good breakdown of the different types of accessibility considerations you want to think about on social media. But at a high level, you want to start thinking about alternative text for images. Typically, most of these platforms provide the ability for you to add alternative text. Another is using camel case hashtags, making sure that the first letter of each word in a hashtag is capitalized. Otherwise, a screen reader won't be able to properly read what that hashtag stands for. For videos, making sure that you have captions. Whether a platform like Facebook has the ability to upload a caption file, so uploading a file, or you burn in the captions directly into the video itself. Those are just a few different things that you can start thinking about when you're considering social media accessibility. But Accessible Social does have a great repository of resources to start looking at social media best practices.
Okay, and I think time for just one more. What different types of disabilities are included when making your website accessible?
It's pretty much any type of disability because you're not necessarily sure what type of user experience they might be having. The most common ones that people think about are those that are blind or visually impaired. Those that are using a screen reader to read a website out loud to you in a text-to-speech format. But someone may have a motor impairment that limits their ability to use a mouse. So can they actually access everything just by using the keyboard? Having cognitive disabilities for an understanding of what is actually on the page. If you're using a lot of advanced terminology and corporate jargon, it may be confusing to someone that has a cognitive impairment. So ultimately, when you're looking at the experience for someone with a disability, it can span across that entire spectrum of really basic needs all the way down to the most important needs. But ultimately, starting by looking at ensuring keyboard compatibility is one of the biggest ones. And even looking at really basic things such as someone that might be colorblind and might not be able to tell the difference between two different types of colors. So ultimately, accessibility is going to be benefiting all of those different types of experiences by starting with that accessibility mindset.
Great, thank you, Will. All right, so, well, we're approaching the end of our time today, so I'm going to begin wrapping up our session. One last item before we end our time together. I ask you to respond to one final question. Now, if you are feeling deja vu, there is a reason. This is the same question I had asked at the beginning of the session. We're very curious to observe any differences in the group's response. So again, please answer it honestly. Doing so will help us evaluate our effectiveness. Please note that your responses are anonymous, and answering the question honestly is essential to helping us understand your needs and our effectiveness. So please take a moment to answer it. The question should be appearing on the right-hand side of your screen. And that question is, again, on a scale of 1 to 5, how would you rate your understanding of digital accessibility services and why it is important? Please use the scale of 1 equals very little understanding, while 5 equals extensive understanding. And we'll give WebEx some time to tally up the answers. Okay, so it seems that we have a bit of 4s and some even more 5s than we had earlier. So that is great to see, and I'm glad that everybody is really learning from our training session. So this is great. Thank you very much, Will. Okay, so with that being said, if you would like to learn more about digital accessibility services at the Viscardi Center, please contact either myself or our digital accessibility coordinator, Jim Corporal. Our contact information is now listed on the screen, or you could simply go to our website, das.viscardicenter.org, and fill out the interest form, and someone will reach out to you as soon as possible. I'll just leave this contact information up for a few more seconds so people can jot it down. Well, this has truly been an excellent discussion, and I know we barely scratched the surface on this important topic. Today's session has been recorded and will be made available on the Viscardi Center website within 2 weeks from today and can be accessed for future reference. Will, you have truly been fantastic. We greatly appreciate you taking the time today to share your knowledge with us. And finally, thank you to our audience for joining us here today as well. We hope you enjoyed today's discussion. And just to remind you, the Viscardi Center greatly values your input, and we hope you will complete the survey that will pop up on your screens immediately following this session. Once again, my name is Mike Caprera, and we thank you for joining us today. Have a great day.